Hello, my name is Helen. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. I'm doing this podcast for you, but if you send it to any of your friends, hi. This is a podcast about antimicrobial resistance, and I'm doing it for my class, which is called Climate, Coffee, and Coronavirus. And we're in that section where we talk about disease ecology, and this is the topic I've chosen. So according to an NIH article in 2019, antibiotic resistance caused 1.27 million deaths and was linked to 4.95 million globally. So that's a lot of deaths, and I wanted to address and understand why. I also wanted to make it clear that I chose you guys not only because you're my parents, but also because of your age. According to the World Health Organization, there is a statistic that says that 40% of the deaths caused by the most common antibiotic-resistant infections occur in Americans 65 years and older. So obviously you guys aren't 65 yet, but you're heading in that direction and you have a lot of friends that are 65. So I wanted to make sure you knew. But if you're saying, like, we know plenty about antibiotic resistance, we've, heard about it and talked about it with our doctor, I just wanted to share a study with you by SIDRAP. It's a website. Specifically, the author is Chris Dahl. He did a study where they kind of asked people about antibiotic resistance and what they knew about it. And 70% of responders incorrectly believe that it occurs when the human body becomes resistant to antibiotics. Now, I hope you know why that's wrong, but if you don't, it's okay. There are plenty of people with you. There's also 64% of people who thought antibiotics could treat cold and flu, which it cannot. So I also hope you know why. But if you don't, again, stick around. And lastly, 32% believe that they could stop taking antibiotics once they felt better, which you might not know why that's wrong. You might know why it's wrong. But regardless, if you do that, please stick around so I can discuss the issues with that. So if we're talking about antibiotics, we might as well discuss their history. They've been around for a very long time. For starters, I guess the first story of them we know is that in ancient Egypt, Egyptians would apply moldy bread to infected wounds, and this essentially was harnessing the antimicrobial effects of mold, like penicillium. And if you don't know exactly how this works, basically the mold of the bread naturally competes with the bacteria for resources. So it would produce antibacterial substances to inhibit or kill the bacterial growth, which gives it an advantage in its environment. And humans were leveraging this antagonistic relationship without knowing it to reduce the harmful bacterial growth and aid healing. And then later on, of course, Alexander Fleming in 1928 discovered that the mold Penicillium notatum produces penicillin, which is a substance capable of killing various bacterial strains, and this breakthrough revolutionized medical treatments. And I'm kind of hoping you guys are understanding that the mold kills the bacteria because it wants nutrients and space, not necessarily for the humans, but rather it wants it for itself. And then later on, this discovery amplified this natural ecological role by enabling mass production of penicillin. And this was good, of course, because we can target more bacterial infections, but it also altered microbial ecosystems on kind of a global scale. And if you're not really understanding what that means, don't worry, I will explain. So after that, the golden age of antibiotics kind of came through. This was in the mid-20th century, and they literally called it the golden age of antibiotics because during this time, there were a lot of bacterial infections killing a lot of people, and we found antibiotics that could treat various very harmful infections. Some examples are tuberculosis, pneumonia, staph, meningitis, syphilis, gonorrhea, scarlet fever, typhoid fever, cholera, and even the plague. So obviously a lot of big ones that you've heard about in history there that we don't really deal with anymore for that reason. And then resistance happens. So essentially the widespread of antibiotics, which was initially a good thing, created very strong selective pressure on bacteria, and it favored those with genetic traits that could be resistant. So the resistant strains proliferated, and this demonstrated bacteria's ability to evolve quickly. So that might sound confusing, but let's start with the basics. You guys know that bacteria grows very quickly. I'm sure you've heard that before. If you play bacteria, it'll be ready within about a day, maybe 48 hours. And so I'm going to put it in an analogy so that resistance makes more sense, because obviously understanding it is kind of the core of this podcast. And so I want you to imagine a village where people use shields as a way to protect themselves from intruders. And at first, the shields work perfectly, but over time, some intruders figure out how to bypass the shields. And so these clever intruders teach others their tricks, and soon only the resistant intruders remain, because all the ones that didn't know how to bypass the shields died. And so the more the villagers rely on their shields, the faster the resistant intruders dominate. And without new strategies, the village becomes overrun. And so I hope you can kind of grasp what's what, but if you didn't, just know that the shields are the antibiotics and the intruders are the bacteria. And how they share their tricks are by sharing resistance genes. And essentially, overusing antibiotics eliminates weaker bacteria while allowing resistant ones to thrive, and it makes infections harder to treat. And if you're wondering how long it took to see resistance emerge in society, it didn't take very long, because in 1944, there was resistance in the bacterial strain Staphylococcus aureus. And so it was shortly after penicillin's introduction. And the more people that are kind of having the opportunity to do this, so the more people that are taking antibiotics and who are seeing resistance emerge from their resilient bacteria, there are ways that the bacteria share resistance, and the more people whose bodies have the opportunity to do this, the more that this can spread across populations and even different species. And so because it was a golden age, this happened very quickly. And once again, I'm specifically addressing people over 50 because there are various studies showing that the immune system is just not as able to recognize foreign pathogens as well. And unfortunately, we also know that we tend to see older people in hospitals more often because they're just going to naturally get sick more often because, like we said, their immune system is weaker, and so they have more things to get treated for. And unfortunately, when antibiotics are given to patients, we said that the drug-resistant bacteria develops in their body, and that person might come back to the hospital to get treated for it because they feel ill, and that strain might end up in solid waste, or it might end up in a door handle somewhere. And so that's how it spreads through hospitals to other people. And so that's another reason that I find this age group particularly important in addressing. And all of that information was from the NIH. And if you're wondering, like, what antimicrobial drug-resistant diseases are there right now that I should be worried about today? Well, there is a bacterium that causes tuberculosis. There is a bacterium called C. difficile that causes diarrhea. And there is one that's called VRE that can cause urinary tract infections. And so those are some examples. I got all of those from NOH Medline Plus magazine. So if you're interested, you can look further there. And if you're like, okay, I'm sold, but, I still don't feel like a personal conviction to do anything with my life differently, then I will tell you, if you're someone who complains about the healthcare costs in the US, well, just know that resistant infections require more expensive treatments, longer hospital stays, additional interventions, and that costs the US $20 billion annually. So that's a lot of money that the healthcare system does not need taken away if it wants to ever be reasonable. And so it is estimated that antibiotic resistance could reduce the global GDP by 3.8% by 2050, with losses up to $100 trillion. So that's more on a global scale, and that's all also from the NIH. And so I'm going to continue to make the news worse before it gets better. But there is innovation occurring. It's just that unfortunately, according to the World Health Organization, only 4 of these 12 new agents are active against at least one of the critical pathogens. So even though there are a lot of antibiotics being developed, not all of them are really considered innovative. And unfortunately, what's more is that over the next 25 years, an estimated 39 million people are expected to die from pathogens alone, which is 5 times the number of deaths from COVID-19 in the last 4 years. And that's from the American Society for Microbiology. And just to bring it back to you guys, the average age in Sarasota, according to the Census Reporter, is 49.8, which is almost your age. You guys are around your 50s. But from the age bracket of 50 to 59-year-olds, 12% of our population is that age in Sarasota. 70% is 60 to 69, 11% is 70 to 79, and 9% is over 80. So obviously we have a large population of older folks, and we've kind of explained why resistant bacteria is more likely to develop in older individuals. And so that's why there is a big problem. And also, like, older people are going to tend to hang out with other older people, and so they can kind of easily share that resistant strain. So once again, I'm just explaining why your age bracket. I'm not trying to, just target older people, but this is why antibiotic resistance is so important for your age group. And if you're like, okay, well, what's one easy way I can prevent all of this from happening? Like, what's a way I can contribute? Well, that's easy. If you are told, for instance, take these antibiotics for 10 days. Well, take them for the full 10 days. Do not stop at the day that you start to feel better. And the reason that you might start feeling better is because you might have killed enough of the bacteria to feel better. But that doesn't mean that all of it is gone. And like we've said a lot of times now, if even a little bit of it is left, it might be that resistant bacteria, and it might continue to replicate and transfer resistance to the ones that are left, and that could create a really dangerous strain. And so that's kind of a big problem we have in the healthcare field right now. And so patients, a lot of times, they think like, okay, I feel better, so I'm going to stop taking it. But that could be really, really dangerous. And I know at the very beginning of this, I sort of mentioned a few misconceptions, and I'm going to go through a few now and actually explain them in detail. But I do hope that the ones at the beginning you are kind of able to understand. No worries if you can't, though. We still have a bit to go. So the first one is that resistance occurs in the body. Obviously, like we've said a lot, it's the bacteria, not your body, that becomes resistant. And then a lot of people think it's only a hospital issue. But the truth is that resistance can develop anywhere if antibiotics are misused. So that can be your house, which can then affect your family and affect their friends and their job. And so that's sort of how it spreads. And then another one is that you can stop antibiotics once you feel better. We just kind of went over this. Stopping early allows that resistance bacteria to survive. And then once more, that it's caused only by human misuse. And this one isn't really relevant to you guys because we live in a more suburban area. But the truth is that in agriculture, there's a good amount of misuse when it comes to like pest control. But we don't really need to worry about that one. That's more of a government issue. Another misconception is that new antibiotics will fix it. And the truth is resistance can develop to any antibiotic. That's why it's kind of an unsolvable problem unless you change human behavior. Because even though you can develop new antibiotics, this can occur anytime with any antibiotic because bacteria grow so fast. So it has so many chances for resistance to occur. And I used to work in an antibiotic resistance project in a lab, and we were creating a new drug. And I can tell you that it takes years and years and years and years to develop a new drug because it's super difficult to develop a drug. If you didn't know, that's why it takes about like $1 billion per drug with like all the entire process happening. And so this is truly not a solution. It is currently our only solution, but it's a bad one. Another thing is that antibiotics work on viruses, and this is not true. They only kill bacteria. They do not kill viruses. That is why we could not develop an antibiotic for COVID. So I just wanted to make sure to address that. And then there's also a misconception that taking antibiotics just in case is safe, but the unnecessary use promotes resistance because, like I said, if you try to kill bacteria, you'll leave that resistance strain in your body. And then that resistance is a future problem. Definitely not. It's definitely a global crisis. We've explored multiple times why that is. And then that individuals can't help prevent it. But the truth is that you do have a lot of power for the reasons I explained. And so a lot of problems in the world might seem like they're out of our control. But the truth is that this one is in our control. And each and every one of us can be a host for a very large problem. And so if we can prevent it and use proper hygiene, then we can prevent resistance in ourselves and thus our families. And I know that you guys have grandkids, and I love my niece and nephew. And so I have to address this because it's very sad and tragic. And it is that they found that multi-drug resistant bacteria results in 700,000 deaths across all age groups. But of those, 200,000 of the deaths are of newborns. And if you're wondering why, it's because children typically experience more frequent infections, and so this leads to more frequent antibiotic prescriptions. They also have developing immune systems that are less capable of fighting off infections independently. Children are typically in daycare center, so they have more frequent physical contact with other children. They also might not have complete full antibiotic courses because they're kids, and it usually gets difficult for parents to be able to get them to comply with the full treatment. So these are some of the reasons that kids tend to be susceptible. And because you guys are from Cuba, like our family's from Cuba, and we now live in the US, which are two very, very different places to see these ecological things play out, I just wanted to mention that I'm looking at a graph that shows a daily dosage of antibiotics per 1,000 population back in 2015. And essentially what it shows is that higher income countries have just prescribe antibiotics more, or at least tend to. It's not a hard rule. But lower income countries tend to be towards the bottom of that, so they prescribe less. So this is kind of a disparity in not only availability of antibiotics, but also we can kind of tell where the resistance is probably occurring, and then guess who that'll end up affecting. And then another major heartbreaking problem is the problem of fake drugs, which is that according to the World Health Organization, since 2013, they've received about 1,500 reports of medications that are either falsified or substandard. So this is specifically malaria drugs, and antibiotics are among the most reported. And if you kind of know where malaria tends to happen the most, then you know why this is sort of heartbreaking. And specifically with malaria, there are about 300 products that were reported. And then antibiotics in general, there's about 250, and there's like painkillers and things like that. So people are taking advantage of the fact that people trust antibiotics in lower income countries to make money by handing out fake antibiotics. So obviously this is tragic, not really relevant to antibiotic resistance, but very much shows where the money lies and where the advantages lie. And then if you're like, okay, I've learned so much about antibiotic resistance, I feel so well informed. Well, I will encourage you that even though a lot of this information was very sad, that just remember that slowing the spread of resistance can be very beneficial for your community. It can mean that fewer bacteria emerge and spread, and it can preserve that antibiotic effectiveness for infections and ecosystems, which could save the healthcare system billions and trillions of dollars. It can protect antibiotics for future generations. So if we know that an antibiotic works, then that could mean that future people get to use it and aren't fighting to find a new one that might have similar effects. So you can do all of that just through individual action. And then it supports global access to effective antibiotics. So if the antibiotics don't even work and people in developed countries don't even have access to them because there's resistant strains now, then imagine developing countries that have fake drugs. So they're going to have even less access to them. So just remember that you're doing it for everyone in the world. And obviously this saves lives. It prevents millions of deaths. So if I could please encourage you to, once again, take the dose that you are prescribed and to trust your healthcare professionals and what they're telling you to do. And I know that you guys like to be involved in your community and help others. So please, if you could encourage your friends to just take the full course. And if they're like, oh, I have to go to the doctor, ask them like, oh, are you getting prescribed anything? Because now you know, and so it's in your hands to make a change.